The Liberty Bell Diner in South Philadelphia was less a restaurant and more a repository for stalled ambitions. Its chrome fixtures, once gleaming with post-war optimism, were now clouded by the breath of 1,000 hurried breakfasts. The red vinyl on the booths, cracked and webbed like dry riverbeds, held the ghosts of countless conversations. For 24-year-old Amelia Vance, this place was both her prison and her shield. 6 days a week, from the pale dawn until the bruised twilight, she navigated its cramped aisles, a study in weary grace, her powder blue uniform a constant reminder of a life lived on the margins. Amelia was a musician without an instrument, a poet without a pen. Her dreams were locked away in a mind too cluttered with orders of scrapple, extra crisp, and coffee, light and sweet. Her tiny row house apartment, inherited from a grandmother she barely remembered, was a testament to deferred maintenance and suffocating debt. Every paycheck was a frantic triage, a portion for the mortgage, a pittance for the utilities that always seemed to be on the verge of disconnection, and the lion's share for the mountain of medical bills that sat on her kitchen table like a malevolent idol. She was 24 going on 50, the vibrant colors of her youth washed out by the relentless gray of responsibility. The source of that responsibility, and of Amelia's deepest, most tender love, was her mother, Clara. Clara lived in a world of soft shadows and missing pages. 18 years ago, a brutal hit-and-run accident had stolen her husband and shattered her memory, leaving her in a perpetual state of gentle confusion. She was a beautiful, fragile doll, her past a locked room to which Amelia had no key. All Amelia had of her mother's life before the accident was a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay a single object, a silver heart-shaped locket, intricately engraved with a pattern of swirling vines and a single unique rose at its center. Clara would hold it for hours, her thumb tracing its design, but she never opened it. "It's too precious," she would whisper, a flicker of profound sadness in her eyes. "The memories are sleeping." Amelia's father was a ghost, a name on a death certificate. She knew him only through the stories of others, stories that were themselves faded and incomplete. He was a good man, a kind man, a man who had loved her mother fiercely, and then he was gone. The man in the corner booth was an anomaly. For the past 3 months, he had appeared like clockwork every Thursday at 2 p.m., after the frantic lunch rush had subsided into a digestive calm. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from sorrow and then polished by immense success. His suits were charcoal gray and navy blue, fabrics so fine they seemed to absorb the diner's greasy light. He always ordered black coffee, which he rarely drank, and a slice of apple pie, which he never touched. He would simply sit, staring out the window at the grimy tapestry of South Philly, his jaw clenched as if holding back a torrent of unspoken words. The other waitresses, Marge and Dolores, had spun a web of fantasies around him. They called him Mr. Sterling, after the name on his platinum card. Amelia just thought of him as the sad man in booth 5. He was a puzzle she didn't have the energy to solve. He never looked at her, never offered more than a clipped "thank you," and never ever smiled. He radiated a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical cold. On this particular Thursday, the October air had a biting edge that promised an early winter. The diner was nearly empty. The sad man was in his booth, a stark silhouette against the weak afternoon sun. Amelia approached, the glass coffee pot in her hand. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice quiet. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes fixed on something across the street. As Amelia leaned forward to pour, her elbow caught the edge of a sugar dispenser she had just refilled. The heavy glass container toppled, striking his ceramic mug. The collision sent a wave of hot black coffee cascading over the table and directly onto the crisp white cuff of his shirt and the sleeve of his expensive suit. "Oh my God, I am so sorry," Amelia gasped, her cheeks flushing with shame. She grabbed a fistful of napkins, her hands trembling. "I'm so sorry. Let me get a cloth. I'll pay for the cleaning, of course." She braced for the inevitable flash of irritation, the cold dismissal she had come to expect. But it didn't come. Instead, for the very first time, He turned his head and looked directly at her. His eyes were a startling shade of gray, like a stormy sea, and they were wide with an emotion she couldn't decipher. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Shock. It's, it's fine, he stammered, his voice a low, gravelly thing she'd never truly heard before. He dabbed at his sleeve with a napkin. As he reached across the table, his suit jacket shifted, and that was when Amelia saw it. Hanging from a heavy silver chain around his neck, partially tucked into his shirt, was a heart-shaped locket. It was tarnished with age, but the design was unmistakable. Swirling vines, and at its center, a single unique rose, identical to the one on the locket in the velvet box at home. The world tilted on its axis. The clatter of the sugar dispenser, the hiss of the coffee pot, the distant rumble of traffic. It all faded into a deafening roar in her ears. Her breath hitched. Her entire universe narrowed to that piece of silver. It was a perfect match. An impossible, perfect match. The coffee pot slipped from her nerveless fingers, hitting the linoleum floor with a sickening crash. Brown liquid and glass shards sprayed across the worn tiles. The few customers in the diner turned to stare. From the kitchen, her boss, Sal, bellowed her name. But Amelia didn't hear him. She could only stare at the locket, the design her mother traced with a loving, vacant tenderness, the only tangible piece of her past. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, disbelieving whisper that barely disturbed the air. That's my mom's." Time itself seemed to hold its breath. The silence that followed the crash was absolute, broken only by the frantic, panicked beating of Amelia's own heart. Arthur Sterling froze, his hand hovering over his coffee-stained cuff. His stormy gray eyes snapped from the shattered pot on the floor, up to Amelia's face. He saw her wide, tear-filled eyes, her parted lips, her entire being focused on the piece of silver resting against his chest. "What did you just say?" he asked. The word was a blade, sharp and precise, stripped of any emotion but a raw, dangerous intensity. Amelia's hand trembled as she lifted it, pointing a shaky finger. "The locket," she breathed, the words tumbling out. "The design. The rose. It's my mother's. I have one just like it. It's the only thing she has left of her past." A storm of emotions passed over Arthur's face. It began with pure, unadulterated shock, which quickly hardened into disbelief, and then, like a portcullis slamming down, was replaced by a cold, impenetrable mask of denial. With a swift, almost violent motion, he tucked the locket completely under his shirt, a gesture that was both fiercely protective and brutally dismissive. "That's impossible," he said, his voice flat and devoid of the crackle of energy it held a moment before. "You're mistaken." "No," Amelia insisted, taking a half step forward, heedless of the glass crunching under her worn sneakers. "I'm not. Her name is Clara. Clara Vance. Please, you have to tell me how you have that." The mention of the name Clara struck him like a physical blow. Amelia saw it, a flicker of profound, unmistakable pain in the depths of his eyes, a wound torn open before it was ruthlessly sutured shut by his iron will. He rose from the booth, his height and the impeccable cut of his suit suddenly seeming menacing. He was a creature from another world, a world of power and secrets she could not comprehend. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out a money clip thick with $100 bills, and peeled off several, tossing them onto the table. It was an obscene amount of money, far more than enough to cover the coffee, the pie, and a dozen broken pots. "Sal, get this cleaned up," he commanded, his voice a low growl aimed in the direction of the kitchen, from where Sal was now cautiously emerging. But his eyes, those devastating gray eyes, were locked on Amelia. They held a look of such deep, wounded fury that it made her physically recoil. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the exit. The little bell above the door chimed a frantic, desperate protest as he shoved it open and vanished into the fading afternoon light, leaving behind a shattered coffee pot, a pool of cold coffee, and a young woman whose entire reality had just been broken into a million pieces. Amelia stood paralyzed, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. Sal was suddenly beside her, his gruff voice laced with concern. "Amelia? Kid? What the hell was that? Are you all right?" You look like you just saw a ghost." Amelia sank onto the cracked vinyl of the opposite booth, her legs refusing to hold her. "I think," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think I did." That night's sleep was a fugitive. Amelia lay in her narrow bed, the familiar city sounds of sirens and distant arguments offering no comfort. She stared at the water-stained ceiling. The image of the locket burned into her mind. Who was that man? Why did he wear a design so intimately connected to her mother? Why did the name Clara cause him such pain? The story of the accident had always been the foundation of her life. Her father dead, her mother broken. A tragic, sealed chapter. Now a new page had been violently ripped open. The next morning, a fierce, unfamiliar resolve coursed through her veins. This was more than a coincidence. It was a breadcrumb, the first she'd ever found, on a trail that had been cold for 18 years. She called Sal, her voice hoarse, and told him she was sick. The lie felt small and insignificant compared to the truth she was chasing. She sat at her small kitchen table, her grandmother's ancient, wheezing laptop humming to life. With trembling fingers, she typed the only name she had into the search engine: Arthur Sterling. The results that flooded the screen were dizzying. This was no mere businessman. Arthur Sterling was the founder and CEO of Sterling Innovations, a global biotech firm at the forefront of genetic research and pharmaceutical development. He was a titan, a visionary, a name whispered with awe in the pages of Forbes and The Economist. Articles painted him as a ruthless genius, a recluse who had built an empire from the ground up after a series of personal tragedies. The articles were vague on the details of these tragedies, mentioning only that he was a widower who had lost his wife years ago and had no children. His privacy was legendary, his power seemingly absolute. There was no mention of a woman named Clara, not a whisper. Amelia scrolled through image after image. Arthur Sterling at a press conference, his face grim. Arthur Sterling accepting an award, his expression unreadable. Arthur Sterling entering a black car, a wall of security around him. In every photo, he wore the same suit of emotional armor she had seen in the diner. He was a fortress. But even fortresses had a point of entry. Sterling Innovations was headquartered in a gleaming skyscraper of sapphire glass and brushed steel in Center City, a monument to a future she could only dream of. It was a universe away from her diner, from her life. Amelia walked to the living room where her mother was sitting by the window, humming a tuneless song and tracing patterns on the dusty glass. Amelia retrieved the velvet box, her heart pounding. She opened it and took out the silver locket. It felt heavy in her palm, a solid piece of a forgotten history. For 18 years, her mother had been a mystery wrapped in a tragedy. Now she was a question that demanded an answer. Amelia put on her only presentable coat, a dark wool pea coat from a second-hand shop, pulled her hair back into a tight, determined knot, and slipped her mother's locket into her pocket. She looked at her reflection in the hall mirror, a frightened girl with her mother's eyes that were suddenly, for the first time, blazing not with resignation, but with a searing, righteous fire. She was going to the fortress, and she was going to demand answers. The lobby of Sterling Innovations was a cathedral of corporate power. The air was cool and still, scented with something clean and vaguely metallic. Floors of polished black granite reflected the geometric light fixtures that hung from a ceiling so high it seemed to touch the sky. A security desk, a formidable block of obsidian, was manned by a woman whose sleek black dress and bored expression were more intimidating than any uniform. Amelia's worn coat felt shabby and out of place. She felt the stares of people in tailored suits, their gazes sliding over her and dismissing her in a single, cold instant. She took a deep breath and approached the desk. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice as smooth and cold as the granite she sat behind. "Yes," Amelia said, her own voice betraying a slight tremble. "I need to see Mr. Arthur Sterling." The receptionist didn't even consult her computer. She simply arched a perfectly manicured eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, I don't. But this is a deeply personal matter. It's an emergency. Mr. Sterling does not accept unscheduled visitors. I can connect you with his executive assistant if you'd like to leave a message." "No, you don't understand," Amelia pressed, her desperation rising. "I have to see him. If you could just tell him it's Amelia Vance from the Liberty Bell Diner." A ghost of a smirk touched the receptionist's lips. The absurdity of the request was palpable. A waitress from a greasy spoon demanding an audience with a demigod of industry. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone dripping with finality. "That's not going to be possible." She turned her attention back to her screen, a clear and brutal dismissal. Frustration burned in Amelia's chest. She wouldn't be turned away, not after coming this far. "Please," she insisted, her voice rising, attracting the attention of a nearby security guard. "Just give him my name. I swear to you, he will want to see me." The situation was unraveling. The guard started to move toward her. She was about to be escorted out, a minor, embarrassing disturbance in the hallowed halls of power. She had one last desperate card to play. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cool, familiar shape of her mother's locket. She pulled it out and placed it on the cold granite counter, sliding it toward the receptionist. "Show him this," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Please, just show him this locket. Tell him the girl from the diner is here with the other one. If he still refuses to see me, I'll go. I'll never come back." The receptionist stared at the locket, then at Amelia's desperate, pleading face. She sighed, a long-suffering sound, and picked up her phone, murmuring into it in a low voice. Amelia waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. The security guard stood a few feet away, a silent, imposing statue. After what felt like an eternity, a man emerged from a hallway behind the desk. He was in his 50s, with a kind face and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a simple but well-made suit, and he moved with an air of quiet authority. "Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm Martin Shaw, Mr. Sterling's chief of staff." He was holding her mother's locket in his gloved hand, studying it with an expression of intense curiosity. "I need to see him," Amelia said. "It's about this locket. It's about my mother, Clara." At the mention of her mother's name, Martin Shaw's professional demeanor faltered. He looked from the locket to Amelia's face, and a look of dawning comprehension crossed his features. He knew. He knew something. "Please," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Wait here." He turned and disappeared back down the hallway, taking the locket with him. Amelia was left standing in the vast, cold lobby, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She was on the verge of turning and running when Martin Shaw reappeared. His face was pale. "Mr. Sterling will see you," he said, his voice strained. "Follow me, please." He led her to a private elevator that ascended with a silent, stomach-dropping swiftness. The doors opened directly into an office that was less a room and more a slice of the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides offered a panoramic, dizzying view of Philadelphia. The space was minimalist and stark, dominated by a large desk made of dark, reclaimed wood. Arthur Sterling stood with his back to her, looking down at the city he ruled. He didn't turn as she stepped out of the elevator. "Martin, leave us," he commanded. His voice was hollow, echoing slightly in the vast room. Martin gave Amelia a look that was a mixture of pity and apprehension, then stepped back into the elevator. The doors slid shut with a soft whoosh, sealing her in. Amelia's throat was as dry as dust. She stood awkwardly, clutching her purse strap like a lifeline. Finally, Arthur turned. His face was a mask of torment. The cold fury from the diner was gone, replaced by a raw, naked pain. In his hand, he held two lockets, his and her mother's. They lay side by side in his palm, identical silver hearts. "You have 5 minutes," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. 5 minutes to tell me how you have this, and to explain your impossible claim. Then you will leave this office and never speak of this to anyone again." The air in the penthouse office was thin, charged with 20 years of unspoken grief. Amelia's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective love for her mother. She would not be silenced. "It's not an impossible claim," she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "That locket belongs to my mother, Clara Vance. The other one you're holding, the one from my pocket, is hers too. It's all she has left from her life before the accident that took her memory 18 years ago. An accident that killed my father." She watched his face, searching for a reaction. His expression was guarded, his gray eyes shadowed and unreadable. I spent my entire life believing that story, Amelia continued, her voice trembling slightly. And then I saw you, in my diner, wearing its twin. You have to tell me how. You have to tell me what you know about my mother. Arthur walked slowly to his desk, his movements heavy, as if wading through a current of painful memories. He placed both lockets on the polished wood, the soft click echoing in the silent room. He didn't look at Amelia, but stared out at the city below, his gaze fixed on a distant, invisible point in his own past. Her name wasn't Vance, he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. It was Dubois, Clara Dubois. Amelia frowned, a seed of confusion planting itself in her mind. No, that's not right. My name is Vance. My father— Your father, Arthur interrupted, a bitter, mirthless smile flickering across his lips. Let me tell you about Clara Dubois. He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were like chips of ice. I met her in college. She was a poet studying literature. I was a graduate student in biochemistry. She was incandescent, different from anyone I'd ever known. The women in my world were heiresses, bred for strategic alliances and society pages. Clara was real. She was fiercely intelligent, wildly passionate. She laughed from her gut and argued about politics and believed art could save the world. He picked up one of the lockets, his thumb caressing the engraved rose. We were together for 3 years. We were going to be married. I had these lockets custom made by a silversmith in the old city. One for her, one for me. A perfect pair. Our initials are engraved inside. He opened the locket and Amelia could just make out the tiny, elegant script. A.S. and C.D. This company, he gestured vaguely at the opulent office, the sprawling city. It meant nothing to me back then. It was just my family's business. All I wanted was her. But my family, my father in particular, disapproved. She was the daughter of a baker from Fishtown, a scholarship kid. In his eyes, she was an unacceptable distraction, a threat to the dynasty he was building. He paused, the silence stretching, thick with the ghosts of what might have been. Amelia stood frozen, her mind struggling to process this new, impossible narrative. Her mother, a poet, in love with a future biotech titan. It was a story from a novel, a life utterly alien to the quiet, fragmented existence of the woman who hummed tuneless songs in her living room. We didn't care, Arthur continued, his voice softening, lost in the memory. We had plans. We were going to move to California. I was going to teach at a small university. She was going to write. We were going to escape all of this. He closed his eyes for a brief, painful moment. And then, one morning, she was gone. His voice hardened again, the sorrow sharpening into an old, well-honed blade of anger. No note, no call. Her apartment was empty. Her friends didn't know anything. She had simply vanished. I spent a year looking for her. I hired private investigators. I nearly destroyed myself. It was as if she had been erased from the earth. He looked directly at Amelia, his eyes boring into her, searching her face, her features, for an explanation that had eluded him for 2 decades. The only conclusion I could ever reach was that she'd left me, that my father had gotten to her, that he had offered her a sum of money to disappear, and she had taken it, that our love, our future, had a price tag. That belief, he said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper, it hollowed me out. It's what made me who I am. I poured all of that rage, that sense of betrayal into this company. I built it into an empire, a fortress of solitude, to ensure that nothing and no one could ever touch me like that again. The story settled over Amelia, a beautiful and tragic shroud. Her heart ached for the young man he had been, and for the mother she never knew. I don't understand, Amelia stammered. My father, the man I thought was my father, David Vance. My mother's caregivers told me they met after her accident. He was a paramedic who helped her. They said they fell in love while she was recovering. They had me, and then he was killed in that hit and run. Vance, Arthur repeated the name, his voice laced with contempt. So that's the name she took. A new life, a new man, a child. The implication was a dagger aimed at Amelia's heart. In his version of the story, her very existence was the final, irrefutable proof of Clara's betrayal. He saw her not as a daughter searching for her mother, but as the living consequence of the lie that had defined his life. Amelia felt the floor give way beneath her. Could it be true? Could the vibrant, passionate woman Arthur described have simply sold their future, created a new life, only to have that one destroyed too? The thought felt like a betrayal of the fragile woman she cared for every day. But something was wrong. The timelines didn't fit. The math was off. "Wait," Amelia said, shaking her head, a new thought cutting through her confusion. "That can't be right. You said she disappeared, and then you spent a year looking for her. The accident that took David Vance and my mother's memory, that was 18 years ago. I'm 24. The timing makes no sense." Arthur stared at her, the cogs of his formidable mind beginning to turn, reprocessing the data, searching for the error in his long-held equation. "The story I was told," Amelia pressed on, her voice gaining a desperate conviction, "is that they were married for years before I was born. If she left you, 25 years ago as you say, then how could I be 24? How could she have been with David Vance?" A new, more terrible possibility began to dawn in the room, a truth far darker than simple, mercenary betrayal. "You're wrong," Amelia said, her voice ringing with certainty. "Someone is lying. Or everyone has been lied to. You have the power, the resources. If you ever truly loved her, if a single part of you needs to know the real truth, you'll help me. Because my mother wouldn't just leave, and she wouldn't have abandoned the person she loved." Arthur turned away from her, a storm raging behind his eyes. The comfortable narrative of betrayal he had clung to for a quarter of a century was being systematically dismantled by a 24-year-old waitress from South Philly. Her existence, her age, the locket in her pocket, they weren't evidence of a crime. They were clues to a deeper, more sinister mystery. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the whisper of the building's ventilation. Arthur Sterling, a man who controlled markets and manipulated molecules, was confronted with a truth he couldn't bend to his will. He stared at Amelia, at her defiant stance, her threadbare coat, and above all, at her eyes. They were a shade of blue he hadn't seen in 25 years. They were Clara's eyes. He sank into his massive leather chair, the fight and fury draining out of him, replaced by a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the ghost of a betrayal, but the ghost of a possibility. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Martin," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "cancel the rest of my day, and get our security chief up here. Now." He released the button and fixed his gaze on Amelia. The ice in his eyes was beginning to melt, revealing an ocean of pain beneath. "I will make some inquiries," he said, his voice strained. "I will look into David Vance. I will re-examine the records of my father's financials from that year. Do not get your hopes up. The past is a monster. You may not like what we find." "The truth," Amelia said simply, her heart fluttering with a terrifying, fragile hope, "is better than a lie." The next 3 days were a masterclass in suspended animation. Amelia went through the motions at the diner, her mind 1,000 miles away in a glass tower overlooking the city. Sal watched her with worried eyes but didn't ask questions, a silent act of kindness for which she was profoundly grateful. On the 4th day, as she was wiping down the counter after the lunch rush, her phone rang. It was an unlisted number. "Amelia, it's Arthur Sterling. Be at my office in an hour." The line went dead. Her hands shook so badly she could barely untie her apron. An hour later, she was back in the penthouse, but this time she was led to a conference room. The long glass table was littered with documents, financial reports, and faded photographs. Arthur and his chief of staff, Martin Shaw, were standing at the head of the table. Arthur looked older, as if he had aged a decade in the last 72 hours. "We found things," he said, his voice grim, dispensing with any preamble. "David Vance. He existed, a paramedic, as you were told. But he died 3 years before the accident that supposedly injured your mother. He was a widower with no children. Amelia stared at him, uncomprehending. But that's not possible. He was there. He raised me for 6 years. An identity was stolen, Martin Shaw supplied gently. Someone assumed his name, his history, a ghost. Arthur pushed a series of bank statements across the table. They were from a private offshore account belonging to his late father, Alistair Sterling. My father was a meticulous record keeper, Arthur said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and grief. Look at the dates. Starting 25 years ago, a monthly payment of $5,000 was wired from this account to a series of numbered accounts. The payments continued for 7 years. He pointed to a final transaction, dated 18 years ago. It was a lump sum, $250,000. The final payment, Arthur murmured, made 2 days after the date on the police report for your mother's accident. The pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture of terrifying clarity. My father paid someone to take her, Arthur said, his voice a low growl. He staged her disappearance. He created a new life for her, a new identity, and hired a man to play the part of her husband. But why? Amelia whispered. Why would he do that? Because, Arthur said, his face contorting in pain as he slid one last document across the table. It was a medical record, old and yellowed with age, retrieved from the files of his father's private physician. It was a pregnancy test. The patient's name was Clara Dubois. The result was positive. The room began to spin. Pregnant. Her mother was pregnant when she was taken. Arthur's gaze met hers, and in his eyes she saw the same dawning, world-shattering realization that was exploding in her own mind. The dates, the timelines. A woman taken 25 years ago, a child born roughly 9 months later, a young woman who was now 24 years old. The fortress around Arthur Sterling's heart didn't just crack, it was vaporized. The anger, the betrayal, the bitterness he had nurtured for a quarter of a century, it all dissolved in a tidal wave of gut-wrenching truth. He wasn't just looking at the daughter of the woman he loved. He was looking at his daughter. The revelation was a sonic boom that left a ringing silence in its wake. Amelia gripped the back of a chair to keep from collapsing, her mind frantically trying to stitch together this new, impossible reality. Pregnant, his child, her, she was his daughter. The words were alien, nonsensical, yet they resonated with the force of an undeniable truth. Arthur made a choked, guttural sound, the noise of a man being broken from the inside out. The narrative that had defined his adult life, the story of a woman who had betrayed him for money, was replaced by a truth of unimaginable cruelty. The love of his life hadn't left him. She had been stolen from him, ripped from his life by his own father, forced into a fabricated existence, all while carrying his child. My father, he breathed, the words tasting like poison. He looked at Amelia, his stormy eyes wild with a desperation that stripped away the years and the billions, revealing the wounded young man he had been. He saw the curve of her jaw, the shape of her eyes, the set of her lips. He saw Clara, and for the first time, he saw himself. The accident, he said, his voice a raw whisper. The final payment, it was a lie to cover the final lie. His mind, always 10 steps ahead, was racing through the implications. He paid the man, this David Vance, to stage an accident, to create a reason for Clara's memory loss, to sever the final ties to her past. And then Vance was supposed to disappear with his $250,000 payment, leaving a traumatized woman and a 6-year-old child behind. He was supposed to leave, Amelia repeated, the horror of it dawning on her. But he didn't die in a hit and run. He just left. He abandoned us. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of this final, pathetic betrayal. A hired stranger had taken his payoff and simply walked away from a little girl and the broken woman he was paid to protect. Suddenly, Arthur's grief coalesced into a white-hot point of rage, a rage directed not at Clara, but at the father who had orchestrated this monstrous deception, and at himself for believing it, for letting her go. He turned to Martin Shaw, his expression terrifying in its intensity. Get me everything on this phantom, this David Vance. Every credit card transaction, every traffic ticket, every alias. I want to know where he is. I want to know what he's been doing for the last 18 years with my father's money, and I want him found. Yesterday. The drive back to South Philly was a silent, surreal journey. Arthur had insisted on driving Amelia home, a silent chauffeur in a glossy black sedan that was as out of place on her street as a spaceship. She didn't know what to say. He was her father, a stranger, a billionaire who had, hours ago, been nothing more than the sad man in booth 5. When they pulled up to her small, shabby row house, he cut the engine. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I have to see her," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. She won't know you, Arthur. Her memory it's gone." "I don't care," he said, his gaze fixed on the front door of the house. "I've lost 25 years. I'm not losing another minute." Clara was in the living room, sitting in her favorite armchair, the silver locket resting in her lap. She looked up as they entered, her blue eyes, so like Amelia's, clouded with a gentle confusion. She smiled sweetly at her daughter, then looked at the tall, imposing stranger beside her. Arthur stopped just inside the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. It was her, older, more fragile. The vibrant light he remembered dimmed to a soft glow, but it was her. Clara. He took a hesitant step forward. "Clara?" he whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. She tilted her head, a flicker of something, not memory, but a deeper, cellular recognition, stirring in her eyes. Her gaze dropped to his chest, to the spot where his own locket lay hidden beneath his shirt. Slowly, as if in a trance, Arthur reached into his shirt and pulled out the silver heart. He held it out in his palm. Clara's eyes widened. She looked from the locket in his hand to the identical one in her lap, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips parted. A single word, a faint, dusty echo from a locked room in her mind, escaped. "Allie?" The name shattered the last of Arthur Sterling's composure. The dam of a quarter century of grief, guilt, and stolen love finally broke. A deep, ragged sob tore from his chest. The titan of industry, the genius, the fortress of a man, crumpled. He sank to his knees on the worn floral carpet of the tiny living room, his head in his hands, and wept. He wept for the woman he had lost, for the lies he had believed, and for the daughter he had never known. A daughter who had been there all along, a living testament to a love he thought had been betrayed. The sound of Arthur's weeping filled the small, cluttered room. It was the sound of a heart breaking and healing all at once, a raw and primal agony that transcended time and loss. Clara watched him, her expression one of profound confusion and a strange, nascent empathy. A forgotten instinct told her this man's sorrow was somehow connected to her own. Amelia stood frozen, a spectator to the collision of her past and her present. This powerful, broken man on his knees was her father. The idea was still too new, too fragile to fully grasp. Her own tears fell, silent tears for the mother she had only ever known as a shadow, for the father she was just meeting in his moment of utter devastation, and for the vast, barren expanse of the years that had been stolen from them all. Slowly, hesitantly, Amelia moved to Arthur's side. She knelt on the floor beside him, her worn jeans brushing against the impossibly fine wool of his suit. She didn't know the words for this, the language for comforting a stranger who was her flesh and blood. She simply reached out a trembling hand and placed it on his shaking shoulder. At her touch, a simple, compassionate gesture that asked for nothing in return, he flinched as if the contact carried an electric charge. Then slowly, as if fighting against the crushing physical weight of a quarter century of compounded regret, he looked up. His face was a ruin of grief, a landscape ravaged by the sudden, brutal earthquake of the truth. The carefully constructed fortress of the stoic billionaire had been razed to the ground in an instant, leaving only the raw, exposed sorrow of the young man he had once been, a man who had loved with his whole soul. His stormy gray eyes, usually so impenetrably guarded and cold, were red-rimmed and overflowing, the unshed tears of 2.5 decades now carving hot, desperate tracks through the stoic mask of his composure. And through that distorting blur of tears, he looked at her, truly, fundamentally saw her, for the very first time. It was no longer a superficial glance at a waitress, a professional assessment, or even a pained look at a ghost of his past. It was a father seeing his child in the flesh. He saw the impossible, perfect fusion of two lives he had believed were forever severed. He saw Clara's untamable spirit in the defiant set of her chin, a resilience that had clearly weathered unimaginable storms with a quiet grace he could only marvel at. He saw his own fierce, stubborn determination etched into the line of her jaw, a refusal to be broken that he recognized with a jolt of pained, paternal pride. He saw the precise curve of her lips, so like her mother's just before she would share a secret or a line of poetry, and the piercing, analytical intelligence in her eyes, a direct inheritance from them both. In this beautiful, strong, and visibly tired young woman, he saw their love made manifest, a living, breathing testament to a bond that had miraculously survived lies, time, violence, and even death. The realization was a secondary shockwave, as powerful and world-altering as the first. "I am so sorry," he choked out, the words not merely spoken, but clawed from the deepest, most guarded vaults of his soul. It was a confession, an act of penance, a lament for a life they all should have had. "Amelia," he repeated her name, as if testing the impossible, beautiful weight of it on his tongue, the sound of it a symphony of lost time. "I am so sorry. For every second of your life. I should have fought harder for her. I should have torn my father's world apart brick by brick to find her. I should have known." His voice shattered on a ragged sob. "But I let my pride, my hurt, become a wall. I believed the lie because it was easier than believing I was so utterly powerless. And in believing that monstrous lie, I left you both. I abandoned you to a fate I couldn't even imagine." "You didn't know," Amelia whispered, her own voice thick with a storm of complex emotions. Tears for his profound pain, for her mother's stolen life, for her own lonely childhood, now streamed freely and silently down her cheeks. But her hand on his shoulder was steady, a small but resolute anchor in his raging sea of guilt. "He built a prison of lies around everyone. My entire life was a story he wrote. Everything she endured. It was to protect me. In her own way, she was protecting us." He reached out then, his hand trembling with the force of his emotion, and took hers. His grip was not gentle. It was desperate. The grip of a drowning man clinging to the only piece of solid ground in a treacherous, unforgiving ocean. He held on as if he feared that if he were to let go, she too might vanish into thin air. Another beloved ghost in his life of profound absences. They knelt there together on the worn floral carpet of the tiny row house. A father and a daughter who were, for all intents and purposes, strangers. Two emotional castaways clinging to each other in the splintered wreckage of their family's history. And in that shared devastation, they found a strange, agonizing, yet deeply necessary comfort. The days that followed were a disorienting blur, a surreal collision of two vastly different worlds. Arthur's universe, a place of silent efficiency, limitless resources, and quiet, formidable power, descended upon Amelia's small, cluttered life with the force of a gentle but unstoppable tide. Her quiet row house, with its creaking floors and faded wallpaper, became an unlikely command center. Teams of doctors, the most renowned neurologists and memory specialists in the country, arrived not in ambulances but in sleek black cars, reviewing Clara's sparse medical files with a quiet, intense focus at Amelia's small kitchen table. The dissonance of seeing these world-class physicians discussing synaptic pathways and experimental therapies in the very spot she usually ate her toast was profound. Within 48 hours, a private, sun-drenched suite at the most advanced neurological care facility in the state had been prepared for Clara. It was less a hospital room and more a serene apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a lush garden and walls painted a calming shade of periwinkle blue that Arthur vaguely remembered Clara had once loved. Arthur wanted to move Amelia out of the South Philly row house immediately, offering her a suite of rooms in his sprawling, silent penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. "You shouldn't be here alone," he'd said, his voice laced with a clumsy, newfound, and almost overwhelming concern. But Amelia, with a gentleness that belied the formidable strength of her resolve, refused. "This is my home," she explained, looking around at the shabby, familiar furniture and the water stain on the ceiling that she knew like the back of her hand. "It's the only one I've ever had. I'm not ready to let it go. Not yet." It was more than just familiarity. It was the last bastion of her own identity, the life she had forged for herself in the shadow of tragedy. She wasn't ready to be completely subsumed by the monumental weight of the sterling name. While one arm of Arthur's empire focused on healing, the other focused on a cold, precise form of justice. The search for the man who had stolen the identity of David Vance was brutally swift. Arthur's security team, comprised of former intelligence agents who moved through the world like ghosts, unraveled the man's 18-year-old trail of digital and paper breadcrumbs in a matter of days. They found him in a small, sun-bleached town in Arizona, living a meager, anonymous life under yet another assumed name. The $250,000 payoff, a fortune at the time, had long since been squandered on failed get-rich-quick schemes, gambling, and cheap thrills, leaving him with nothing but a paunch and a permanent look of weary defeat. Arthur flew there himself on his private jet. He didn't bring security into the meeting, nor did he bring lawyers. He confronted the man in a desolate roadside diner with cracked vinyl booths. A setting so painfully similar to the Liberty Bell, it made Arthur's stomach clench. There was no shouting, no threats. Arthur simply sat opposite him and laid out the facts of the man's life and the life he had helped destroy, his voice low and as cold as the grave. The man crumbled completely, confessing everything in a pathetic, wheezing torrent of words. The deception, the carefully staged accident, and the final cowardly act of abandonment. He had left, he claimed, because he was terrified the Sterling family would one day come looking for the child. He had run to save his own skin. Justice, Arthur knew, would be clinical and absolute. But for Arthur, the purpose of the trip was fulfilled. He had needed to look into the eyes of the man who had left his daughter and the love of his life with nothing. What he saw was not a monster, but something far more contemptible. A weak, hollow man. Slowly, tenderly, a new chapter began for Clara. Surrounded by the best care, and more importantly, by the constant, gentle presence of Arthur and Amelia, fragments of her past began to surface like objects rising from the bottom of a deep lake. They were like shards of a shattered mirror, not yet forming a whole picture, but catching the light in brief, dazzling flashes. She began to call Arthur Allie with a growing confidence. And one afternoon, as Amelia was brushing her hair, Clara reached up, touched her cheek, and whispered, "My star, my little star." It was a forgotten term of endearment from a lifetime ago, a missile of love that pierced Amelia's heart and brought fresh, healing tears to her eyes. Their new life as a family was a delicate, unchoreographed dance. Arthur, a man accustomed to controlling every variable, struggled to navigate the unpredictable landscape of human emotion. He was clumsy in his attempts to be a father. He had Amelia's crushing medical debts and mortgage paid off with a single silent transaction, but these grand gestures felt hollow to Amelia, who craved the simple currency of his time. Amelia, in turn, found it hard to reconcile the intimidating billionaire from her diner with the broken, grieving man who was her dad. But they were trying. Most evenings were spent in Clara's comfortable suite. They would take turns reading poetry to her. Poets Arthur remembered she had loved, and sometimes a particular line of verse would trigger a spark. A brief moment of lucidity would descend. Her blue eyes would clear of their fog, and she would smile. It was a true radiant smile, a glimpse of the incandescent woman she had been, a smile that felt like the sun breaking through a lifetime of clouds. One evening, Arthur found Amelia in the small living room of the row house. She was curled up on the sofa, a worn notebook in her lap, her brow furrowed in deep concentration as her pencil flew across the page. He watched her for a long moment, struck by how much weight she had carried for so long. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly. Amelia looked up, startled. "Oh, it's nothing, really. Just patterns, designs." She hesitantly showed him the page. It was covered in intricate, swirling designs. In the center was a perfect rendering of the rose from the locket. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. "Clara, Clara used to draw just like that, he whispered, a profound sense of awe in his voice. She called it the poetry of the visual world. He looked at his daughter, the artist, the dreamer who had not just survived, but had kept a space for beauty alive inside her. He finally understood. My family's foundation has an endowment, he said, the words coming out in a sudden, impassioned rush. A significant one for emerging artists. It covers full tuition at any art institute in the world, the Pratt, the Sorbonne, wherever you want, and a living stipend. It's meant for someone with a unique vision. Amelia stared at him, and then a genuine, unburdened, brilliant smile lit up her face. It was not about the money. It was about the profound validation of being seen. He saw her. I'd like that, she said, her voice soft. I'd really, really like that. He smiled back, a fragile, unpracticed expression that was still learning its way onto his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the 2 silver lockets, which he had had polished. I had them cleaned, he said. He opened one, revealing the tiny initials AS and CD. He then opened the other, which was empty. I think your mother would want you to have this one, he said gently, to put your own memories in, to start your own story. Amelia took the locket, its silver surface bright and warm from his touch. She looked from its gleaming potential to her father, this brilliant wounded man, and thought of her mother, slowly returning to them from the shadows. Her mother's story was no longer a void. It was a testament to a love that had been buried but had never died. And her own story, she realized with a sudden, soaring clarity, was no longer defined by a past she couldn't remember. It was about a future she was finally free to design for herself, with a father by her side and a mother's unbreakable love as her guide. It would not be a simple path, she knew, but for the first time in her life, it was a path illuminated by an undeniable, brilliant hope, a clean page waiting for a new, more beautiful pattern to be drawn.